I was a little skeptical about the provenance of this particular quote, because if you Google it, you can't find where Mandela said it, and it seems also to be credited to a guy called Joel Barker, who's a sort of a white American business guru. And it's also quite similar to an ancient Japanese proverb, which translates as action without vision is a nightmare, or pointless. But we'll work with it anyway. So action without vision is only passing time. Vision without action is merely daydreaming, but vision with action can change the world. We could call it the Sounds Like Mandela lecture. And in a way, it illustrates one of the great frustrations of modern times, which is, does anybody really know what they're talking about? In a world where everyone has a voice, nobody has authority, anyone can be an expert, everyone has a platform, where do you find authenticity? Where do you find the vision? We seem to live in an age where most of us are living devoid of visionary leadership. Whether in mainstream politics, the networks, societies, or movements that we're all part of outside of either politics or our worlds of work, and in our worlds of work, it is often the vision thing that we feel is most lacking. There is action with vision, or, there is still action without vision, or vision without action. Huge convulsions of action going on around the world, and of course groups of dreamers who have the vision but don't have the means to make them real. But the lack of both together has seemed to leave generations of people frustrated, and it's one reason why so many people, I think, are now attracted to the fringes, whether politically or religiously. It's one of the reasons why our world feels so divided, partly because it is, and partly because huge numbers of people in the mainstream, the centre ground, ordinary people, if you like, feel unled, uninspired, unrepresented, and to some degree undone, a bit cheated by it all. Yet, in my lifetime and career, we have witnessed extraordinary change on all sorts of levels. And so, over the next few minutes, I just wanted to sort of tread this path on a micro level between British broadcasting and the questions that a lot of us in this room have wrestled with over the decades around diversity in British broadcasting, and the bigger political and international scene. Because for much of my career, I feel I have witnessed amazing vision and action in real life, and I've covered it a great deal. But something that has happened recently is that we feel lacking, I think, in that whole question of leadership. As I suggested earlier, I started in this business when I was 18. It was 1988, and it was a very, very different world politically. Very, very turbulent. Just as turbulent, if not more turbulent in reality, as the world feels today, even though the world feels completely crazy right now, and so many things are going on all the time that you just don't see coming round the corner. But if you think about that time, those of you who were around there, if you think in terms of broadcasting, first of all, the BBC was in the midst of the John Birt revolution. The mission to explain was still sort of feeding its way into the way the BBC decided it wanted to tell stories. It was very much on a mission to educate the British public. John Birt had come here believing that television was failing to explain the world, to wrestle with the great challenges of what was going on in society and in politics. And so on a simple level, he decided that he had a vision of how the BBC was going to do this, and he was going to do some simple things to turn it into action. He was going to have a political program on a Sunday. He was going to have a foreign affairs documentary program. He was going to have a social affairs program in the week, and Panorama would continue to bring all of those things together. He had a very clear sense of what he wanted out of targeting particular audiences. There was a youth programs strategy, there was an ethnic minority program strategy, there was an Asian programming unit, there was a black programming unit. These were ambitious times where, regardless of whether you agreed with it or not, and a lot of people didn't, a lot of people felt it was too prescriptive, and that the way that the Burtists set about telling stories, which was essentially to do, well, what it was supposed to be was to do your research, work out what the story is, and sort of almost write it before you went out and filmed it and found it for yourself. Some people thought that was too prescriptive, that you were going out to try and prove something was right. But I think in that philosophy, was something very, very valuable, something that we seem to have lost, which was that ambition to really grip our audiences and try and explain a complex world to them. And I think there's a very strong argument that that's precisely what's needed right now in terms of the broadcasting landscape. You know, Bert, for all the skeptics, don't forget, also was the man who created that digital strategy that we are still living with in many ways within the BBC in the mid-90s, back in 1996. He saw it, and he saw what was required. And if you think about the people who were around then as well, you know, people were brought in. So you had people like Janet Street Porter brought in to run youth programs, people who were not sort of the establishment. You had people like Samir Shah, who was the most important ethnic minority bloke in the BBC. And bizarrely, he kind of still is. That's how strange things are, because he still makes important programs, probably some of the most important current affairs programs in the BBC. But if you go back to that time, politically, it was also a time of huge change and huge vision. And I think what was happening around then became, it was a crucial time in terms of what was going to come and what was going to become the process within society and politics that I would argue led to so many people then feeling let down. Because we were dealing with the collapse of communism, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the implosion of the Soviet Union, the collapse of apartheid. But essentially this war, if you like, the Cold War with communism was the thing that framed everything. And it also, to a large degree, had framed Mandela in those years. If you think about Mandela's famous speech in court where he talked about racial equality being a cause for which he was prepared to die, much of that speech was in fact trying to say we are not communists. So he was fending off the charge of being a red while actually pursuing a vision about racial justice and racial equality. And that was what prevailed over a period of time. And the collapse, I think, of communism had an undeniable effect on what the left in Britain was doing, trying to respond to Thatcherism, trying to come up with a new political vision, a new political culture that would in turn take over power and try and deliver social justice, which was what they felt was missing at the time. But because they were dealing with this period in which capitalism had won and communism had failed, that framed exactly what they were doing. It framed their ambition, and it framed what they felt they could get away with in terms of what they were asking from people, whether it came to massive change, whether it came to nationalization, whether it came to taxation. And so I think the time that we were living in the late 80s, early 90s, was so much shaped, I think, by the overall political movement that it's easy to forget that that's partly why we are where we are now. In those first years of mine in television, I was going to some places where you were seeing huge amounts of vision and huge amounts of action, huge amounts of convulsion in places like the collapse of Yugoslavia, where you were seeing people demanding their freedom, their democratic freedom, and their freedom from being told what to do from a place they didn't respect. And that was all happening. Those freedoms were being delivered through conflict, but ultimately being delivered. And yet you were also going, I was also going in those places to places like Kashmir in 1989, where you would go and people would still also be chanting for freedom. But because there was nothing really underpinning it in terms of where they saw that freedom coming from, or where they saw it being delivered, or how they saw it being delivered, that story hasn't really changed at all, I think, in 30 years. And if you see documentaries now filming in the same places that I was going to in 1989, you're seeing the same arguments playing out. I think because there is a frustration, there is a sort of a, some people have a vision that they're unable to act through, and some people just have, a sort of an unguided sense that they want their freedom and they're unable to deliver it. So I think in those early years of my career, I was treading through places where you were seeing massive change, underpinned by big political, philosophical change, but also some places where a lack of vision meant that nothing much was going to change over time. And if you bring it back to where Mandela found himself in South Africa, once he was out of jail and trying to form that first government, I think where the quote becomes, very Mandela-like, is that the vision that he talked about in that speech in the 1960s for a country of racial justice was all he was trying to deliver in that one period of government. He went into government as president and he effectively said, I'm going to have one period, I'm going to not seek re-election, I'm going to have one goal. I'm not going to try and solve all South Africa's problems, all the social problems of this country. I'm going to try and keep the country together, because that is the big vision. That is the big fundamental problem. And if I can deliver that, then I will have succeeded. And if you think about the expectations that were on him at the time, they were absolutely incredible. They make expectations of Obama in the early years, or of Tony Blair after 1997, utterly dwarfed. Yet he was able to tread that line very effectively. I think as time went on, to bring it back into television and how television changed in those years in terms of our expectations of diversity, what had started out as a real feeling of vision in the late 80s and early 90s started to dissipate. In the same way that big ideas were struggling, I think, politically, big ideas in terms of how to really change our lives, our industry, were also struggling. Many people at the top thought they'd basically addressed this problem, that they were not racist, they were not prejudiced, and so they had done what needed to be done, and that things would just naturally change and naturally get better. The departments that were dedicated to delivering this stuff were broken up. The Ethnic Minority Programs Unit, the incubators for ethnic minority talent, were smashed, and executives would trumpet their achievements in this whole area. And many of us who were in the industry by then just had to kind of go along with it, because we had no choice, because we didn't have the power, we didn't have the agency to sort of have a vision of our own. And I think that, just to take a sort of a dogleg right up to sort of current, current times, is what may now be changing. Because if you think about the effect of the Weinstein affair on women in the workplace, I think everything's changed. Nothing is ever going to be the same again. Because I think, even in this country or this industry, if you take the combination of pay differentials that have been exposed, the gap between men and women at the BBC, and the way women are talking amongst themselves and realizing that the things they've had to put up with, or have put up with, from men in these industries, in the entertainment industries, and just in everyday life, in every industry, has got to stop. And I detect a real change in the way people are talking about this, and I don't think people are prepared to put up with it anymore. And the question is, I think within television and diversity, are we going to have that same sense of, we've had enough, enough is enough, of putting up with being told it's a slow road to racial equality, it's a slow road to full representation, it's a slow road, the pipeline doesn't deliver people at the top. as quickly as we'd like to, much as though we'd like, like them to be. And I think that sense of impatience that I think will now emerge is the theme of our times. A sense that the changes that we were so excited about on a big level and on a micro level, whether you're talking about political change internationally or change of our industry or our companies, has somehow failed the majority, or at least a big minority. Now, that's not to say that individual political ideology has all failed. I'm not being as simply sort of party political about it in that way at all. But I think there's been this sense of excitement over the years that while we thought things could only get better and that things would get better, we have found ourselves wondering over the years, well, have they really? And how much by? And is it all a bit of a disappointment? We do have to check ourselves in terms of this anger. I mean, when I was covering the 2015 election, I took a bike ride across the north of England just to try and find a vehicle with which to vox pop people, really talk to them about what they thought. And obviously immigration was emerging as a huge election issue even then, before the referendum debate. And I remember cycling up this hill in Yorkshire where there were no houses at all, and there was one farmhouse right on the top where I saw a woman outside tending her flowers, and we stopped and started having a chat, and I explained what I was doing, and I said, do you mind telling me how you're going to vote? And she said, well, I've been a Conservative all my life, but this time I'm going to vote UKIP. And I said, well, why is that? And she said, well, the country's full up. And I looked at her and I looked around and I said, I literally cannot see another human being. I can't see another house. What are you talking about? So I do think in our sense of expectation and our sense of what's going wrong with the world, we also need to check ourselves and check each other in terms of what is reasonable to expect. But if you look at Trump, Brexit, Catalonia today, ethnic movements in Burma demanding new status, new recognition, or the failures of the Arab Spring, everywhere you will see people demanding change and action, but there is a big question as to whether there is an underpinning vision to it. It may be, I think, that we all need to take the lesson of Mandela, the lesson that I mentioned before, that a vision, if you're going to have a political vision or a business vision or a diversity vision or whatever vision it might be, it needs to be focused, it needs to be achievable. In a world post-Cold War, where we don't have to have those big ideological arguments anymore, it gets harder to solve the world's problems. In a world where there are plenty of ethnic minority people on screen, and there's quite a few of them off screen as well, and they're rising up the ranks, it's quite hard to have a sensible conversation about how you really make the final change to make this really a fair and equitable place that reflects the kind of world we live in. So I think the answer is to have small, focused, achievable targets, whether in the world of politics or in the world of the BBC. The BBC has a challenge right now in that its director of news has just announced that he's leaving. And it's got to fill a job. The BBC, I would argue, whoever gets that job, should give themselves some simple targets. Because in 1988, when I joined the corporation, the BBC didn't have such a big trust problem. The BBC was trusted. Broadcasters were trusted. These days, the BBC's political editor has to go around with guards. People on the fringes of society say they don't trust the BBC in the same way. So obviously, you've got a trust issue that you've got to address. But perhaps the biggest issue that you've got right now in the corporation and in the industry is the question of fairness. And that's with regard to both gender and ethnic minorities. And so my challenge to whoever takes up that next big job, and the next big job after that, because Tony Hall's not going to go on forever, is make this place fair. If you have that as your one manifesto pledge, your one thing in the interview that you go in and say, that's what I'm going to deliver, you will also deliver excellence. And you won't need to worry about that. And if you deliver excellence, you will deliver trust. One thing follows the other. So my advice to whoever needs to have the next vision is just to have a relatively small and achievable one for this industry, and that's to make it fair. Thank you very much for listening.